Morning, everyone. My name is Gary Sealing. I'm a developer at Element 84, and I'm going to be moderating all the talks in Room C today and tomorrow. It's great to be here with everyone online today. I've always enjoyed ETE, and I'm grateful to all the attendees and speakers who've been flexible and to help us make this a great online conference. In the spirit of agility, our first talk today is from Julia Kastner, VP of Product at Neuroflow, who's going to talk about making sure our agile processes deliver real value to customers. Like during the keynote, I'll be collecting questions through Slack and the Zoom chat. Feel free to post your questions and react to the ones you like, and we'll ask the popular questions as time allows. Over to you, Julia.
Great. Hi, everyone. How's it going today? Thanks for joining us online. And again, sorry that we couldn't hang out in person. Excited to talk to you a little bit about measuring success and being able to help your organizations ship the most valuable code through data-driven development. So what we're going to cover today is a little bit about us at Neuroflow. I think that'll just help with some context. And then we'll talk about how we define success and how that turns into measurement, go through a couple of case studies, and then leave some time for questions at the end. So a little bit more about me. As we mentioned, I'm the VP of Product at Neuroflow, and so my responsibility is to lead product, design, and data science. And that's really my focus. And my background is product management. I've worked in product management in a couple of different types of organizations, both business-to-business SaaS and consumer, and I bring all of that to our health technology company. So a little bit about us at Neuroflow. We're a behavioral health company. That means mental health. And our mission is to bring more access to mental health across care settings. So normally you think of mental health, you think of being in therapy, but our mission is really to take that engagement and bring it into primary care, bring it into our everyday lives, or allow behavioral health to be something that more people access and engage with. The way that we do that is through a platform for doctors. So primary care or pain doctors can add their patients to our platform, web-based platform, and they can, through that platform, they can measure and manage the behavioral health of their patients. And meanwhile, the patients get access to our iOS and Android mobile apps to engage with their behavioral health. So that could be doing different types of activities or providing data, and everything that they do in the app comes back to their providers. One of the most important things that we do is about figuring out who needs the most help. So being able to assess a whole population and surface the people who need the most care. So as an example of what that might look like, here's an example of someone who's not using Neuroflow, where they go in to see their primary care physician in April, they complete an exam and they score sort of mild for behavioral health. Under traditional settings, that person just sort of gets sent home, no big issue, we'll see you next year. But we could imagine in this case, maybe Sam did get more severe, behavioral health did become an issue. And because of comorbidities between behavioral health and physical health, Samuel ends up in the hospital, which is obviously not the preferable outcome. So with our platform, the idea is that by monitoring someone over time, even if they start out mild, if they start to become more severe and that their scores start to go up, they can be assigned a therapist, they can be given more resources within our app, tools to help them understand their behavioral health, take some of that stigma away, and hopefully bring that score back down. And the reason that we're particularly excited about our offerings is that, as I'm sure you all know, behavioral health is a really important facet of the crisis that we're all living through. That with all of the self-quarantines and stay-at-home orders, there's a lot more social isolation, and so we know there's a lot more behavioral health issues right now. So the ability to remote monitor people is more important than ever before. Okay, so that's us, and that's what we do. And I'll talk a little bit then about, from the product side of things, how do we figure out what to measure to help us build the best products and to deliver the most value to our business and to our customers. And so I want to take a moment to share sort of my frequent experience of what happens when folks try to do success tracking without sort of going through the full process that I'm going to talk through with you all. So this is what our analytics looked like before I started at Neuroflow, where we had a bunch of actions like BC and button click, which like maybe mean the same thing, and a whole bunch of random things that are being tracked, but like, are these events or are they categories? A little confusing. And then I drilled into BC, and there's like a bunch of things, but like, what's an HSD? And so I think what often happens, and to be honest, this is what I see almost every time I start at a new organization and pick up their analytics stack, is that a whole bunch of clicks are being tracked, but maybe not with a ton of thought about what's important to track, how to organize it in a way that people later can understand it, but also just to make sure that we're only really tracking the things that matter the most. And that can really help us to keep focus around our data program and our product management toolkit. So starting at the top, and as we think about the process of tracking to make sure that the products that we build are highest value, the first thing we need to do is align on goals. And so I really think of the top 3 types of goals being new sales. So obviously, especially as a startup, we're a 30-person team. Being able to drive our sales engine is really important to us, but that there's also customers that we're trying to retain. Usually you don't want to necessarily need to invest in 100% of your customers, but you need to know which ones are driving the most value for you, and obviously you want to retain as many as you can. And then you need to be able to invest in your sort of longer-term competitive advantage. So not like this short-term growth engine, but what are the things that are going to really help you in the future? Then we take those business goals and we translate those into product goals. So some of the ones that we focus on the most are acquisition and engagement. And that's for both the B2B product and the B2C product. A lot of those words tend to sound more like B2C for consumer tech. So for example, we might want to ramp our clinics up faster into the platform. So I think of that as an analytics goal. Around, we have a doctor's office that signs up for this platform. How do we make sure that they get active and start seeing value as quickly as possible? Another one might be about helping patients to sign up faster. That starts to look more like a consumer acquisition funnel, or supporting inbound marketing. So the ability to understand, to help a marketing team drive more interest in our company. On the engagement side, we're really trying to drive the usage of our features with the hypothesis that more usage of our features means that people are getting more value out of them. And if they're getting more value out of them, they should stay around longer, or that should ultimately affect our sales abilities. And so that's partly it's about making sure that they adopt the new features that we launch, but also that they stay in the platform for as long as possible. Some of the product goals also include overall platform quality. So that could be accuracy, making sure that any data science models that we build provide useful insights. It's really easy to build a model that doesn't provide useful insights. And so the goal is to make sure that the things that we do actually deliver value. Anything that looks like messaging or alerting should be reliable, and it should be interpretable, so that those things mean something. And in our case, products need to meet clinical guidelines. So we need to make sure that our clinical partners have signed off on the things that we build, and that that's part of the value that we're delivering. And then, like any tools or platforms, you want to make sure that you have stability and scale. And obviously that includes, if we bring on a bunch of new users or we collect a ton more data, that the platform can scale with that. And as a non-engineer at this conference, that's not my area of expertise, but ultimately that should be part of our product goals when we're building things. But that also, that new functionality should be able to be added without a ton of confusion. So I think of if you build things that don't scale from an engineering perspective, you build tech debt. If you build things that can't be added on from a user experience perspective, you end up with UX debt. And so those are some of the goals that we think about when building features as well. So then we take all of that, those are our high level goals of what we're trying to do. And then the goal is to figure out what can we measure. Some of those things I mentioned were really abstract. So what can we measure that really helps us understand if we're moving in the right direction? So the focus of most of this talk is going to be on the quantitative side, partly because I love the quantitative side. I think that's really interesting. But I think it's also worth taking a minute to talk about some of the qualitative metrics that we measure and some of the qualitative feedback that we get. And I think it's also important to talk about the qualitative side because it can be confusing with the quantitative sometimes, and so it can be really helpful just to separate those things. So one of the things that that we love to look at from a qualitative perspective is as a proxy for whether we're moving in the right direction, is are the features that we're building ending up in sales pitches? And that they can really be in two parts of a sales conversation. They could either be in the core sales presentation, or they could be the answer to some objections that the sales team has. I think it's really sort of highest value if it's in the core pitch, and then sort of secondary value if it's in the objections or questions section at the end. But either way, I think that's a really good sign that the thing that the product teams are building is really valuable to the sales team. Not just that they said, oh yeah, that was cool, or like, I think that's neat, but does it actually show up in the pitch itself? Similarly, a lot of the features that we end up building come from customer requests. So that could be conversations through our customer success team, but that could also be requests that show up in our ticketing system like Zendesk and our support from end users. And so how many of those are things that have been addressed? You could think of that as sort of quantitative, right? But I think of that still as this qualitative feedback section of giving us input into whether we're moving in the right direction. As I mentioned, as a clinical operation, as a clinical company, clinical value is also something that we need, and that can also generally a qualitative metric around whether clinicians or clinical teams or internal clinical teams agree with what we're doing to sign off on it, and then we're HIPAA compliant, so making sure that anything that we're doing from a regulatory perspective is signed off as well. And FDA and whatnot, that's not something that we're subject to, but making sure that we're staying within the bounds of what's appropriate from a clinical perspective. So then on the sort of qualitative feedback side, we love to collect our own information. So the stuff on the business value side is really our partners, our internal stakeholders, and working with some of the information we already have, versus qualitative feedback is really our team going out and soliciting new feedback on the things that we collect. So we'll do customer interviews, we'll work with our customer success team to set those up, and go through designs and get that feedback. And then survey data is another one that we'll do, where we'll put surveys directly into our mobile app about specific features. We did one recently that was about our journal feature and said, why do you write journals? Do you like the way this works? If you could change anything, what would you change? And that we can start to see are the things that we're building or working on addressing the major concerns of our customers. But this is what I think sort of the meat of this story is. So there's all of that qualitative data that we're collecting of different people's opinions, but it'll be really hard to know if those individual stories or even that survey data is sort of real and unbiased unless we can match it with rigorous quantitative data. Quantitative data is not going to answer all of our questions around who likes what and how does that really affect sales. It'll be really hard to connect all the dots. But that if ultimately you release things and people aren't using them, you'll know for sure that something's going wrong. So to talk a little bit about the way that I think of the two main types of quantitative data that we collect are either database data, the things that live in the depths of our platform, or the analytics that we build to track the most important user actions. And I bring this up and sort of pause here because I think this is a very common gotcha. When I inherited the analytics stack at my current company, there was a table in the database called user actions that was tracking a ton of random analytics events. And I'm sure they weren't random at the time, right? Some stakeholder said, are people using this, or are people doing that? And in fact, they had even built an email system where every time someone logged in, the COO got an email. And that, as you can imagine, was blowing up his email as we grew. And one of the most important things we did on our data stack was to start to understand the difference between what are the things that should be database data, and what are the things that should be analytics data, so that we can start to use those the right way. And I'll talk a little bit more about the difference. But first, to go into what some of these things are, what we have on the database side is really the artifacts that are created as part of using the platform. So in our world, some of the most important things are that a clinician can create an activity for a patient to do. So when they create that activity, it becomes an object in our system that then gets sent to the patient. And then when the patient completes that activity, it comes back. And so that data is sort of our source of truth. It's the kind of thing that our QA is testing day by day. There's a lot of rigor around the core interactions of our platform. And that's true about any kind of technology is going to have this set of artifacts that end up being both used by the application layer and used by the analytics layer, by the business intelligence side. And so those things tend to be most reliable because we have so many different pairs of eyes on them, and they become so core to what we do. So for example, are people getting the notifications to do their homework? Which messages were actually sent by our systems? What transactions were completed? So for example, in our application, patients can redeem points for gift cards. How many points were earned and how many gift cards were redeemed is really important information for us. That's not this sort of top layer analytics, this add-on pieces of interaction information, but it's really the guts of what we do. So you can think about like Twitter, a tweet is something that is part of your interaction, but it's like core to what the platform does. And so I think knowing which are your most important artifacts and tracking those and understanding where they are is really important to building the right success metrics. And it works doubly because as you're building your user experience, you're thinking about what's most important, and then it's just one more step to make sure that you're thinking about them from that data perspective also. They're organized in a way the team can understand them. Then another piece that I like to think about is the model. So anything that you're building that looks like AI or data science, any calculations that are happening in your platform, those are things that are also database data that you should be able to go back and take a look at from a success metric perspective. Then on the other side is sort of as opposed to the things that get made, right? Like the things that like happen in the guts of your application. There's the stuff about how people are really interacting with your front end. What are people really doing? And that answers a very different set of questions than like what happens. Like what are people actually doing along the way to make that happen? And so that's where you add on your Google Analytics, your Firebase, which is what we use for mobile analytics, or a whole bunch of other tools. Happy to chat sometime about all of those different types of tools, but I think ultimately it's more important to figure out which things you track versus which tool you pick. And then, as I mentioned, the goal is to figure out which of them are the most important clicks or interactions that you actually care about, and tying those back to the business goals that we discussed before. And I'll give some examples of that when we go through these case studies, but I wanted to pause and make sure everyone understood the word funnel, because I throw that around a lot. One of the most important things we track is on the product team. What a funnel means is that sometimes you'll have a process that you build a user experience where you're going step by step. So to use the Twitter example, you open up Twitter, you start to write a draft, maybe you edit it for a while, and then you close it out either successfully or unsuccessfully. And so the way that we think about that is the funnel is the journey from creating the thing or starting the process to ultimately finishing the process, and that some people always drop out along the way, and that's why it sort of looks like a funnel. Then another element that we love to use to track some of this kind of information are heat maps and recordings. So why would you need both analytics and heat maps? The value of a heat map is it basically takes a screenshot of your whole experience, and then it allows you to go through and see a bunch of different types of clicks. Whereas the front-end analytics, which we're figuring out what's most important, are defining the steps of that funnel. And I'll give some examples about this, but just wanted to sort of introduce the concept. And recordings, as you can imagine, is watching someone do the whole thing, which is really good for spot checking and sort of building intuition, but can be really hard to compare across a large group of people. So as I mentioned, it's really important to think about these different types of analytics tools because there can be negative side effects for picking the wrong tool. And so an example of this is if you try to throw too much stuff in your database, like the example that I gave you, it's going to be really inefficient usage of your backend system. And then it's also going to require a bunch of different types of maintenance to maintain. I won't go into the details, but you probably are all more technical than I am about backend engineering, but I think you can imagine that if you wanted to track all the things that we track from analytics deep in your system, a lot of that ends up being stuff that you don't need later. And so you're investing a lot of effort to build data capture up front that isn't going to be useful to your product organizations down the road. So that's where those kinds of things, the things that are just about interactions, things that are in the front end that are changing more frequently, those are great things to drop in your analytics system. On the other hand, if you threw everything into your analytics system, and everything was just Google Analytics, or to be honest, worse, Tag Manager, chances are that those are the kinds of things that break more often. They tend to get less QA love. We do run everything analytics through QA, but it's just never going to have the same number of eyes on it as something that's core to the platform. And so ultimately, the things that are in your analytics decay at a faster rate than things that are in your database, especially the ones that are most important to you. And then also, if you threw everything into your analytics, sometimes it can be hard to take those analytics insights and add them to your data science models down the road. Again, probably because the accuracy isn't as clean, but also sort of the format that they might show up in might not be as useful, or they might not be associated with other important information. Tends to be a little bit more work to put the pieces back together down the road. And then heat maps are really useful for getting a feel for what's going on, but they tend to be a snapshot in time. And so they can be biased based on the audience that saw them at that moment in time and a limited sample size. All right, so this is what I think is the fun stuff, is looking at, now I've talked sort of at a theoretical level about all the different types of objectives that we can set for ourselves and our goals, and then the different types of metrics and tools that we use to track to make sure that the things that we're building are really delivering on those goals, that we're moving in the right direction. So I talked a lot about heat maps, and so here I think that a nice example, so this is our website. The one on the left is our previous homepage that we've just redesigned, and the one on the right is our contact us page. And so you can get a really quick snapshot here of what's happening. So you can see on the homepage that there's like a really heavy dot. I'm pretty sure that's the About Us, which goes to show that the homepage isn't really answering that question. And then the other thing is you'll see a very low amount of clicks on the rest of the homepage, especially these bottom two sections. So that's really clear evidence that we built this homepage in a way that's not delivering the value we intended. And so we've redesigned it to have much more interactive middle section so that we can actually drive more value for people, have more options to help people get where they're really trying to go, and maybe also answer in a clearer way who we really are. On the right, the Contact Us page, you're seeing a ton of interaction on these sort of specific calls to action, and then a lot of interaction in the footer, but less in the sign-up section itself. So that turns in, again, and then a ton of interaction in the navigation, which means that people got a little bit lost. So a ton of information about how we should probably reorganize this page to make it really clear how to get in touch with us with different contexts, and maybe rethink this top form altogether. It's not seeing quite the number of submission clicks that we would expect. But again, we could validate those hypotheses by adding more clicks on the specific buttons so that we get a really clean conversion rate to understand what's going on. Another example, so this is, I wanted to give you an example of a funnel, and in particular, this funnel is about a B2B product. So normally when people think about funnels, they think about consumer tech where you have an acquisition funnel where you're trying to get people through a sign-up process. But this is actually a workflow process, which is that administrators of our population can paste a large number of people into a search field and search them all at the same time and then perform actions. And the reason for that is if they haven't integrated with their medical record system, they might want to do something about everyone who's coming in today. So they can pull a report from their EHR about everyone who's coming in today and then search for all those people. But what you're seeing here is that in step one, we're actually seeing that the highest volume of events are about people manually searching, which means that instead of pasting, which you can see is barely even here, this idea of pasting, most people that are using this functionality are actually just manually searching a bunch of names one at a time and then coming up with this list. And then they're going through and you can see that they're submitting their search, they're getting some errors, They're getting some additional success messages. They're managing some duplicates. And then when they've completed the search, and that's sort of the end of the funnel. And so you can see them sort of make their way through the funnel, and we can track on this right-hand side where drop-off is happening, but also really understand what's working about this flow that we've built, and then how are people actually using it. And that can help then go back, and we can do some of that qualitative information and bring this data back to some of those users and say, you know, we talked to you about this, you have really good qualitative feedback, but it looks like you're using it a really different way. What's going on? And it becomes part of the conversation around how we build for B2B companies, how we build SaaS technology. And just a quick note here, one of the greatest things about Google Analytics is it's set up for sort of 3 layers of organization, which is good because then too many layers, you end up with a ton of complexity with your teams, but that it's really nice to be able to organize yourself. So this one, what we did is we created a category called bulk search. So here's our category, it's the highest level. And then we listed a bunch of actions, which you can see are all verbs. So like click, search, copy, but that you can actually read these and understand what they mean. And then we've used the 3rd level of data analysis for these labels. What we've done is actually put the number of people that were in the search, so that then we get this really robust story of this bulk search analytics in a way that's really easy for people to find later. A totally different type of data that we look at is how do we know if a model is working? So as you remember, one of the goals that we have is about accuracy, making sure that our models are working the way that we would expect them to. And so one of the things that was part of our core hypotheses around severity is that you kind of expect a quasi-normal distribution, and that you sort of expect that the vast majority of people are on the less severe side, and then it sort of swings down. And so then when we go and we look at our actual analysis, that's, as you can see, it's exactly what we saw, except that the moderately severe and severe are basically the same. And that's a really good sign to us. Is what we decided to do was that if someone was on the edge between moderately and severe, from a clinical perspective, we'd rather surface them than not surface them. So knowing that there's some error in any prediction that we make, if we were in doubt at all, we bumped them up towards severe. And so the fact that moderately severe and severe are the same like that is a really good sign that the model is working the way that we would expect to. And so just taking a quick snapshot like this can tell us a ton about whether the algorithm is doing what we wanted it to. Obviously, we still need to go and spot check and find a bunch of different use cases. But this is an example of using that database data of all of the scores that have been calculated and are sitting in our backend, and being able to take a look at them to understand if the products we're building are working the way we expect them to. On the B2C side, we built a feature for patients to be able to track their own pain. So every day they get a notification that says, how is your pain? And they can rate that on the score. And what we decided to do is, as opposed to some of the other activities in our platform where the providers assign them to the patients, for this one, we decided that patients could actually set up their own notifications, and we would just sort of market it within the app. So a lot of little like pop-ups or little notes being like, don't forget, you can sign up your notifications, but we didn't know if people would actually opt in to using this feature. And so what you can see here was that our initial round of marketing started, and it goes sort of from 0, and then it comes up and it plateaus. And that was sort of our first round of marketing it. And it sort of flattened off, and we invested in some more marketing within the app, and it sort of picks up again. And now it's flattened off, so now maybe there's something else that we need to do. But it was really exciting to see that people found it and sort of opted into it. And we'd actually paired that with a whole bunch of analytics around all of that marketing so that we could see which of those marketing opportunities were driving people's interest. On the database side, we were also really interested to see if they would actually set their own time of the notification, because that was part of the functionality. And so 8 o'clock was the default time. You can see that's still, the majority of people were just choosing the default time, but we saw a wide range of times that people actually opted into for themselves. all the way up to the middle of the night because it's an interesting time, but to each their own. That's why we build personalization. But you can see a really nice spread of people really adopting the feature and using it to its maximum. The other thing that we can then do with this database data around the number of people using this feature is we can actually slice it by organization. And so you can see here that there's a couple of organizations where they have the most patients using it. And that gives us a sense that, yes, there's like a wide range. And we actually compare this to the overall population, sort of giving a conversion rate per organization, which can be a really useful metric in understanding if we're delivering value to our most important customers. So again, going back to that original goal of customer retention, we can actually deliver a new feature, make sure people are using that new feature, but also go back and check which organizations are the ones that are using that feature the most as a way to talk to our customers about the value we're delivering. Another tool that we use around, which is, I think of it as a subcategory of analytics, is A/B testing. So ultimately, in order to run an A/B test, you need to define some success metrics. And so this is an example of an onboarding test that we ran where we had two different versions of our onboarding experience. And so I've listed out some of the things that you need below in order to set up an A/B test. You need to set an analytics event when the flow starts, and then you need to set that one important conversion event at the end. You're going to have a lot of metrics of different types of things that you can use to track if an A/B test works, but that it's most important to have one specific event at the end to help an algorithm like this run. You can always track additional analytics to see what's going on with your two variants. And so in this case, we were looking at, did they start onboarding, and then how many people completed onboarding. And that was a nice, clean way to see if our two versions were working. You create, what you need is tools to create the two variants. So in this case, this is through our Firebase analytics. There's a ton of tools, again, another conversation for another day. But that what we can then do is see, what we use here is when we have two specific features that we want to build and we're not sure which one is really going to be the winner. We can release both of them and then start to see which one actually drives the most value for that one specific piece of analytics. And so in this case, you can see version B won by a lot. I think in this case, it was that we built an onboarding version where the patients had to do a long list of things before they could get through. And the other was we gave them some choice. So really exciting to be able to use this kind of data to really move the product forward in a way that we feel really confident about. We've run it against a control. Then another piece to talk about is our point system. I think I mentioned this a little bit about the ability for patients to earn points and then redeem them for gift cards. And so, when we think about this feature, we tie it all the way back to our business goals. Fundamentally, the goal is to drive more engagement, but specifically to drive engagement with types of activities. So on the left, you can see that funnel. So we've used our front-end mobile analytics to track how people made their way through the redemption flow. And that you can see it, like if you squint at it, I took the numbers away for you, but if you squint at it, you can see that a lot of people do in fact make it to redeeming a reward. We might be able to have some room for improvement in there, but it doesn't really answer the question on its own about whether we're actually driving engagement. But one nice proxy that we can look at is, well, when people were earning points, what were they earning them for? And so you can see here that it's our daily streaks and our mood and sleep that drive the most points in our platform, but that there's this category of questionnaire, which is actually one of the most important things that we do. It's actually a relatively small section. And so we're going to be investing a lot more in driving more value around that feature just by taking a glance at these kinds of success metrics. So percent of points by category actually becomes a really important success metric for us. So giving you a whole bunch of examples, I've thrown a lot of stuff at you, but happy to answer any questions. I think they're going through the Slack. Also, as a little bit of self-promotion, NeuroFlow is always hiring. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to me or take a look at our careers page. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
All right, so the first question I see here, what drives the heat map, like mouse location versus clicks?
Yeah, great question. We'll go back to look at it. So this one is the click data. So like each individual one is about where specific people are clicking. But the tool that we use called Hotjar, you can toggle it and see scroll, and it'll show you like how deep into a page people are going. I'm sure there's other tools that would give you the motions and things like that. But we usually, for something like a website, just getting a feel for where people are clicking and then how deep they're scrolling tends to answer most of the questions.
Cool. So this question is from Mark. If you're managing a product with very few existing metrics, how would you get started?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some of the features that I've worked on came from nowhere. So I think the number one goal is, again, defining what the goals of your new product might be. So I'll give you an example. So that search feature, this one, that came out of nowhere. So we had different types of search flows and things like that. So the first thing is to, if you're building a product, you still have to go through the normal product management process of defining some user stories and acceptance criteria. So you have a reason that you're building a thing. So you've maybe got a brand new website that you're about to release, or you've got a brand new feature like this. And so you still start from that question of what's the ultimate goal of the thing that we're building, and then working backwards. But the other main trick is to track as little as possible upfront. I think you'll find that a few key success metrics when you're first getting started is enough to really understand what's going on. So I would look for, is there an action that someone's taking that looks like the thing is done? So that creation or submitted or complete, right? You can see here number 7, search complete. Like that's going to be the most important thing. We know that user experience is done when. And then you would start at the beginning and be like, okay, well, when did it start? Well, it started when they landed on this page. So maybe it's page view. Or it started when they clicked start, as you can see there. Okay, great. So you got the beginning and the end. That's usually the most important thing. And then you could start with, okay, if I was going to track one more step along the journey, what would it be and why? And that can often give you a lot of information about how that thing is going. The other thing is you could just start with those completion events and add a Hotjar recording and start to see how people make their way through. And then if you see people are getting stuck or they're dropping off, that can then help inform what other steps of the funnel are important to track.
Interesting. So I'll ask one more question about the Hotjar thing since we're on the subject. Somebody asked if you've seen any performance issues in your web UI related to the generation of the heat map.
Maybe it's just because our engineering team is fantastic, but we've never had any issues with these third-party tools. They're really built to be lightweight and to stay out of your performance. I think that there are things that you can do to decide when they load on the page to make sure that if they're slow, they're not going to slow anything else down. The other thing we spend a lot of time doing is, because we're HIPAA compliant, if we use Hotjar on our core platform, we have to make sure that we don't send them any personally identifiable information. And so tools like Hotjar often will have the ability to make sure that you're obscuring information. So there can be a little bit of dev work to set up these tools, but let me tell you, it saves a ton on the analytics tracking down the road, because you're not tracking every single click on those pages anymore.
Sure, that makes sense. All right, so this next question is from Luke. As an engineer, how can I best help some of the more front-end teams upstream from my team in the value stream to make sure we're measuring the right things and using the data properly?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that we have our back-end folks collaborate with us most is that sometimes when designing back-end architecture, there's a bias towards the application layer, right? You've been given a user story, or you've been collaborating with a product team about a feature, and that you are brainstorming, okay, these are the tables that we're going to set up so that the application runs the most efficiently. But what we started doing is having our lead data scientist, or someone on the data analytics team keep an eye on that architecture and collaborate with a back-end team around those tables and table structure, or creating additional views in the database to help, so that just because something is going to be most efficient for the application doesn't mean it's going to be the easiest to query down the road. I think that's a really exciting opportunity. I think the other is just making sure that everyone on the team understands what those top business goals were in the first place. And that can help the people upstream collaborate all together around, why are we tracking the things that we're tracking? I think it's great for a whole product team to keep an eye on over tracking, right? As we start to see, these, as I said, every time I inherit a new analytics stack, there's a ton of clicks being tracked. And just another pair of eyes on that thing, does it really make sense to track all of those things? Because most of the time they break, right? That's a lot to QA, and chances are that will break over time. So I think just being another person in the group to be like, do we really need to track all of those events? Which ones are the most important ones? And being able to have that conversation is usually half the battle.
Cool. All right, so the next question, can you talk more about identifying a source of truth metric? Does it change as your business goals change?
Yes and yes. So I think a good example of this was that we had talked about what it meant for a patient to be active on the platform. So I think we started this about a year and a half ago. So I've been around, a few months on the team, and we came up with a metric for active, which was that they had done something within, I think we said 45 days. So we come up with that metric, and it actually became a status in our platform. So it wasn't just an analytics or a KPI goal, but actually was a user-facing definition. And then, and that assumed originally that the patient had registered. So they had to be registered, and then they could become active if they had completed an activity in the platform within 45 days. Well, as we started to develop our sophistication understanding of usage, that they probably shouldn't, 45 days, having been inactive for 43 days, it's actually a pretty long time. And so we started building probability models that show that, if you're not active that long, you're probably not actually still active. So maybe that definition, using additional data to help define that definition. But then the other thing was that we built out a new experience on a tablet that a clinician could use in person to collect information from patients in person. And so the patient no longer needed to register before they could give us data. And so we've changed that metric now from active to engaged. And engaged is now defined by whether or not they've done anything, whether it's through a tablet or through our experience that they have to register for. So you can be engaged with or without registering. And we started defining daily, weekly, monthly engaged users so that we could then talk more specifically about, okay, we have these daily engaged people. We have people who show up like on a weekly basis. And then what does it look like if we expand that horizon a little bit more? So yeah, those core metrics tend to change. But if you think about some of the core goals, right? Acquisition, engagement, accuracy, and performance and scalability. Usually your top KPIs are going to be very important for one of those top goals. So that's why usually some of the first KPIs we set up are about acquisition. How many people do we have? And then the second group of KPIs for a product tend to be engagement, having a really clean and clear definition about what it means to be engaged. And then you can sort of build on it from there.
Cool. All right, so another question, what would you suggest for an internally used product, such as a data warehouse that was built proactively with minimal upfront input, i.e., if you build it, they will come?
Yeah, if you build it, they will come happens all the time. I would say the first thing to think about is that the good news is that if someone builds it, they did have a goal. Maybe no one measured it, and maybe no one defined it up front, but if it was built, someone somewhere in the business had a zany idea, and they thought it was important. So I would, if it were me and I inherited something like that, I would want to reverse engineer, what do we think that goal was in the first place? So maybe if there was like a big data warehouse built, someone thought that it was going to really speed up their internal BI, and that there was some, ability for an internal team to get access to data more quickly or more easily, which is really then an adoption and engagement metric internally. How many internal users within our company were going to actually adopt this new business intelligence system, and then how many were going to engage on it, and in what frequency. And so then, assuming something like that, or maybe just asking around and seeing if anyone knows who built it and why, and what the original hypotheses might have been. then you can go and define those metrics yourself and measure them. So how many people are using this, and what types of tools or techniques or analytic systems do we need to build to figure out who's actually using this? And then how do we go and figure out, so how many people are using it, how often, and what are the main use cases? And then from there, the answer might be nobody's using it. The main use cases it was built for aren't working anymore, and that ultimately it's not achieving those original goals. And then you can build the business case to say, okay, let's repurpose it for something else, or because the ROI is not there, let's shut it down altogether. I think one of the most important things that a product manager does is help turn off features. So sometimes building this analytics case allows for that example of why it's time to retire something and save that effort for the engineering team.
Cool. I think that's a nice segue for one of these questions. How do you take the metrics full circle, i.e. back into the Agile planning process?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of the journey, right? Is that good features are never done. And so maybe they come with a big upfront investment as you launch the thing, but hopefully you're analyzing it and going back to it. So as you can see, I think we're still on the bulk search screen. I think that's a great example where we had built an MVP, right? We used Agile and a lot of lean design methodologies to figure out what's the first iteration of this thing that we're going to build. And we built it in an end-to-end valuable fashion based on the qualitative research that we've done. But we didn't have any quantitative research, so we hadn't built it yet. So then we released it with this kind of tracking, and we can see where are the errors happening. So it turns out we ended up building a tool that was a little bit error-prone. And so we started seeing a lot of errors showing up. And then we also saw this usage of the manually entered search instead of the pasted search, which is number 8 all the way at the bottom. And so what have we done wrong that's made people use it in a different way? And so then we can design small agile experiments to see if we can adjust these numbers. So we have an iteration. It's a couple of days of dev time, but it's nowhere near the original investment that we put into this first pass, just to make sure we have something that works end to end. And that small bit of value that we've designed is specifically around this hypothesis of how do we get more people to copy and paste. So we think that's where the real value will be from the sort of business story that we're trying to create. So we took this quantitative data, we had a qualitative conversation, we understood some of the problems that people were having with the flow that we built. And we also actually ended up pulling some of the data de-identified from our customers so that we could use that for an additional prototype. And we're now building a different type of pasting functionality that we think will have a ton more value. And then we defined a potential other slice. If that doesn't get us there, we have another little chunk of value that we can build. So the original paste was pasting in names, but we thought about maybe pasting in IDs, patient IDs from their EHR instead, and then a new interaction around error resolution that we think will lead to fewer errors and help them clean their data a little bit better. So we have the sort of initial minimum viable product, but then we can look at this data, find the problems, and then design like little bits of value, which can then get scheduled into our Agile Scrum.
Interesting. So there's one more question about Hotjar. Do you know how much time or effort it took to implement, and if there are any blockers or challenges in doing that other people might run into?
So I think for the website with WordPress, it was non-dev. I think that you just take a little snippet out of Hotjar and paste it into WordPress. Mm-hmm. And if you're not worried about the HIPAA or obstructing personal information, that was, I think, super quick. And then you can check its performance, and if there's any issues, maybe there's a little bit more finagling to do. I think they do a pretty good job with that out-of-the-box WordPress integration. Whereas in our core platform, when we introduced it to our core platform, it took a little bit more time. I think we did maybe like a day of a dev spike for the engineering team to make sure that the HIPAA piece worked with our infrastructure, to make sure that we weren't going to be sending the wrong information, and to figure out which pages we felt most safe. So we actually ended up not putting it on each page, but that we sort of ran it on a page to see what kind of HTML it was pulling in to make sure it was safe before adding it to an additional page. So now I say it's like maybe a couple of hours of dev time to take that quick peek and do a little QA on it every time that we release it to a couple of pages, but it's really slim, and we don't do it that sort of with a little bit more of an upfront investment. And then now it's just sort of more testing and making sure it's working okay. But it's been a pretty quick engineering project. And I think from an ROI perspective, there's just so much value in the amount of data that we get from it compared to that little bit of dev time. And so I think compared to these analytics, if you were trying to track all those same things, that ends up being a lot more engineering work and a ton more QA work than something like Hotjar where you can just sort of drop it in.
Sure, that makes sense. Another question, what tools are you using to show these metrics to management?
Yeah, great question. So we have a system that we call is called Metabase, which is sort of a startup version of a Looker or a Tableau. But I think any of those tools, so the Lookers, the Tableaus, any of the BI front ends should work basically the same. You just want to make sure that it's something that allows for someone to do SQL and someone to make charts. And so I think we're in the process actually of evaluating if we want to move to one of those more robust alternatives. But that if you're small or if you're just getting started, like Metabase has been really quick and speedy. It's basically just a front end on a database. And then we have a big project ourselves to go and build out a little bit more data warehouse capabilities if that's something that's going to ultimately drive better performance for our BI tools. But there's a lot that you can do just by taking your database data and throwing the Metabase on top. You can run SQL into it, so you can someone who knows SQL can just start running queries. But it also has a nice UI to be able to slice and dice some of that data, and that can get you a chunk of the way before needing to build out a full BI team.
Cool. All right, it looks like that's all the questions we have. Thanks so much for doing this talk and answering all these questions. That was really interesting. Oh, there's a couple of people typing, so I'll give people a couple of minutes just to see if there's any more, but that was great.
Awesome. Thanks for attending.